Okay, so again, what we're doing is we are walking through the code inside of this Murach ASP.NET Core MVC second edition student project. And so this is chapter 11, and the assignment is to build the quarterly sales app. And what this chapter 11 is all about is on custom validation. And so we dive a little bit deeper into validation in this than we have done before. And so you can kind of see here, data driven, we've got employees and drop down list of employees, and it filters all of those employees' sales, and sales have quarters, and you can add employees, and there's some validation on that, and you can add sales, and there is some validation on that. Of course, all of that's up in the nav bar. So we've got employees and we have sales. Those are our two tables. And then we've probably got a view model to show both employees and sales. That's one approach. You don't have to use that approach. You could use ViewBag as we've done before in the class. So as always with coding, there's more than one way to solve it. This one answer that we go through doesn't have to be your exact answer. So I will start by creating a new project, share my screen, and let's start by sharing my screen. And I'm going to create a .NET Core web app MVC. Project 11.1, and this is employee validation project inside of a solution. Spin it up. Okay, so you can kind of look at the employee table, if you will, and extract what you need out of here. You can look at the sales table and extract what you need out of here. Of course, those tables are going to be our models. And so I would start in the models folder by adding those classes. Now, for me, I like to build incrementally, right? I don't like to do it all at once, right? Code a little bit, test it, add on. Code a little bit, test it, add on. So that's going to be the same way for my validation. Like I might add some validation, the easy stuff, and then add on as I go, right? So I'm probably just going to get this kind of going without a whole lot of validation, especially without the custom validation. And then I would add on the custom validation later, keeping in mind that when we're messing with our models, that those models tie into our database design. So when I go back and refactor my code later on, I'm probably going to have to drop my database and recreate it, and that's fine. I'll just go through that and just again kind of build this out incrementally. And that's the plan. So I'm going to start by adding an employee model inside my models folder. And again, you can pretty well look at this: first name, last name, birth date, hire date, and manager. Now, it's kind of natural, at least it's natural in my mind, that when I see a manager to think, oh, maybe there's a manager table because there's a manager name and a manager ID. And that is maybe one potential solution, but I have another way of going about it where we actually don't need a manager table, but kind of going here, you could see we're creating this person, and manager and that person can't be the same person. So we got some kind of validation here that we'll address, and we already have the quarterly sales for this person in the database. So again, this is all some interesting, unique validation that we haven't had. When the app starts, it should display the quarterly sales data and provide a drop-down list that allows a user to filter by employee. Got it. The web app should have a page to enter a new employee and sales. To keep things simple, this app doesn't provide edit or delete. Okay, here's some validation for the employee. First, last, date of birth, and hire are required. Date of birth and hire dates must be valid dates that are in the past. Hire date must not be before 95. A new employee, so there's a lot of validation. A new employee may not have the same first, last, and date of birth as an employee that's already in the database. A new employee may not have a manager with the same first name, last name, date of birth. That is, employee and manager may not be the same person. Okay, again, so a lot of this is like built-in validation. A lot of this is more custom. So let's go back to public class employee and bring in the employee ID. Right, of course, this is going to be our primary key. Identity column in our database. First name, get and set, and kind of set your first names to an empty string. Now this is going to be required. We read that, and the error message, please enter a first name. And then, did we use the display? I don't remember using.
You co-demoed it, but we haven't really used it in an actual lab yet. You used it in the registration one?
Oh, in the, okay. So, so we get the display name, if you will, to be first name of this property. So when you get the error message, it doesn't say first name together. It says first name with the space, right? This is what this will be what the user sees instead of the property first name. And there is a string length. String length, by default, these are nvarchar max in the database. And if you remember, nvarchar max means that in the database you can put as many characters as you want, but if you change the string length, it'll be nvarchar 100s, aka 100 characters. In other words, setting some sort of upper bounds on the number of characters in a first name. So there's some of that validation. Nothing really too custom yet. Let's do last name. And kind of copy and paste those three. Please enter a last name. String length 100. Display name is last name. The next one is we're going to have to circle back and do a lot of our validation on dates. Dates are always the challenging thing to validate. And so I'll do a date time property. So it is nullable, and I'll call it date of birth. And so we will do required. Please enter birth date. And for right now, I'll also add a display. Of birth date. So again, we will kind of come back to this for some additional validation. date of birth, and there's also another date of hire. Prop, date, time, date of hire. And let's give these some attributes. Of course, required. Okay. The next thing we'll do is an int for the manager ID. And there is no other table for this, so it's just going to link up to the employee ID. So, you know, employee number 1 can have a manager ID of 0, which means no manager ID. Then employee number 2 can have a manager ID of employee number 1. And so that would just link employee number 1 as the manager of employee number 2. And then for that, let's just set a display of manager. And we'll make a read-only property, so no set block, to get a full name. And there was a requirement in there. I know a couple people asked me how to do this. So we'll have a property called full name. We'll use the arrow syntax that just returns this dollar syntax, right? They call that string interpolation. My favorite word in C# right now. First name, space, last name. And so the full name just returns the get block on the full name and the get block on the last name separated by a space. Now again, this is no custom validation yet. We'll just kind of get this up and running and come back for the custom stuff. You have any?
Is the display name for the manager, is there a reason why we don't have one for employee ID? Just calling it like employee?
Well, right. So a lot of time, you know, you'll see that drop down. Please select a manager.
Mm-hmm.
So, but you won't actually see employee ID anywhere on the page. So the reason there is you're not going to see an error message for employee ID. It'll be auto-generated.
Right.
And you're not going to have to
Yeah.
So for manager ID, is there not a reason you put like required there because you're requiring one like on the page, or is that done somewhere else?
Well, but let me ask you that. Are you requiring a manager? Because can you not have no manager?
Oh, maybe I'm not sure. I could be wrong.
Well, I think in that case you would just set it to, we have a thing for no manager now.
Yeah, no manager would be 0.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking you can have no manager.
Oh, okay, so it's not required.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. So with that model kind of set up, Ryan, did you have a question?
Yeah, on mine, I didn't have in the daytimes to be nullable. Is there what purpose is it for them to be nullable?
Well, so that just allows nulls in the database. So you know database columns can be nullable or not. And so this will allow you to do an insert without doing that. Now, again, it's going to be required, but that really just makes it nullable in the database.
In your context file, it's kind of all that affects.
But it is a valid question. It's like, well, hey, if you're requiring it, then why make the nullable type? I wonder, you could probably get by without making it nullable because again it's required. And if you are an employee, you will have a date of birth and you will have a date of hire. So I don't think there'd be any problem with leaving that off. I don't foresee that being a problem. Okay, then again, kind of, so that's our employee right there. Next one we're going to have is sale for employees. So you're going to have a quarter, a year, an amount, and an employee. So let's spin up a sales model. Add a class. Sales ID. And again, this could be sales ID, or it could be ID, or ID, or ID. Like these are all pretty much automatically going to be a convention for making a primary key. Pretty case insensitive there. So the quarter, as you kind of saw, well, there's 4 quarters in a year. So not only is this going to be required, it's also going to be a range. So let's get required. Please enter a quarter. And the range of acceptable values, 1 to 4. And then again, you've got a quarter and you've got a year. The year is required with an error message that says, please enter a year. And there's some more validation on year that we'll come back to. An amount would be next. We got quarter, we got year, we got amount, and then we've got an employee. So let's do prop double amount. Kind of interesting. I remember the decimal data type in C#, and we learned that decimals were good for money, but doubles obviously holding decimal points should do the job. Required field, please enter an amount. Let's bring in that employee with the employee ID and the so this is the foreign key column, and we also mark these employee objects as validate never. Trying to remember the name of this property. We hit this again. By the way, next chapter is a good one, chapter 12 on entity framework. We got a foreign key column, and I think it's just called an entity reference column, something of that nature. Yeah, what's up, Vinny?
Can you explain the validate never, like, and what it's doing again?
Yeah, so I can. I'm kind of glad you asked because it's all in the same section. So here's our foreign key property. Foreign key property. On page 161, to avoid unexpected data validation results, you can decorate a related entity with the validate never attribute. And so it basically says, hey, you can sometimes, when you're working with foreign key properties, and the name of this is escaping me right now. This can cause some unintended validation, like basically error messages that pop up that don't belong.
Gotcha.
That's the short version. Like,
I'll read it again and see.
no, I got you right here. Not that you want me to read it to you, but this is what you got at the moment. When you use a foreign key property, MVC will sometimes perform unexpected or unwanted data validation on the related entity property. That's this guy right here, the related entity property. For example, in this movie list app, an error message will be displayed indicating that the genre is required even if the user selects a genre from the drop-down list. So you're selecting a genre from the drop-down list and it's saying, hey, genre is still required. So it's like, hey, don't worry about validating this. That's because selecting the genre sets the genre ID property, not the genre property. So a lot of times you'll set an ID property on the page, but you'll never set like this employee object. Not never, but one way to prevent this validation is to decorate the related entity property. So we'll just call this the related entity property. Yeah, it's all on the same page on the book. How about that? Okay. I need to bring in a connection string into my app settings file. So after allowed hosts, I need to basically connect into connection strings, curlies, unless you have a high accuracy on your typing, you're likely to make a typo here, myself included. So the name of our database is quarterly sales that we're going to create. That's the end of that line. Multiple active result sets is true. And then in my program CS, add controllers with view, we need to basically get the connection string from our configuration file. So we're going to get our connection string. Now we're not quite ready for this because we need to have a context file, and the context file is obviously going to be where we seed our data. So in our models, let's add a class called sales context, and inherit DB context. We need to bring in entity framework core. So using Microsoft Entity Framework Core, in order to bring that in, let's install everything that we need off of Tools, NuGet Package Manager, Browse, Entity Framework SQL Server. Okay. Entity Framework Tools, Entity Framework Core Tools. And just because I've always been in the habit just installing the whole Entity Framework Core, I've probably been doing this wrong all semester, but it works. Probably just get by you just doing the Entity Framework Core, and that includes everything. Now that we have that, now we can add using Microsoft Entity Framework Core, and now we can bring in DB context, and our constructor brings in some options, DB context options. Sales option, calls options, base options, curlies. Two tables, public DB set. Table 1 is table of sales, called sales, get and set, null, and then I think that's called the null suppression operator. Interesting name. Basically, it's like, hey, you got a warning. Don't worry about it. All right. Now our seed data. So we'll just add 2 or 3 employees and a handful of sales. Okay.
I would think like that would be like bad practice to do, you know, and if like you explicitly have to tell the software and the, you know, in the code that you're writing in, like,
Don't warn me.
that kind of seems like it's not a good,
Sure.
not good code.
Sure. Protected. So Joyce, again, just working with the kind of the data, the DOB. And manager ID of 0, which means no manager. And I'll just copy this employee for employee number 2. Who's Chip and Joanna Gaines? You recognize that?
The HGTV.
Gains, Joanna Gaines. Sure. She looks about my age. We'll say 84. And she was hired.
I said 84. I thought you were talking about like years old. What?
It's not that young.
You're old.
So we're gonna hire Chip and Joanna Gaines. He's probably a little bit older.
You a fan of their work?
I watched a lot, I mean, yeah. I mean, who doesn't love Chip and Joanna Gaines, right? Are you not?
No, I think they're great.
Yeah, they're talented.
Yeah, talk about taking a situation and running with it. They turn one show into a whole empire.
No kidding. They're in Target now and everything else. Chip and Joanna have a manager. Their manager is Joyce. So that's just kind of wiring up Chip and Joanna to have their manager. And I'm good enough with 3 employees.
I think you have to change that last employee ID.
Good eye, thank you. Okay, now let's add some sales. Wait, there. How about that? Amount 23456. Employee ID is 2, so Joanna. Hey Jenny. Alright, so let's bring in a few more sales. Paste another sales ID of 2. Quarter 1, year 2022, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and this is also employee 2, comma, more sales, sales ID 3, quarter 4, 2021, 19,876. Chip made his first sale. And the last sale, quarter 1, year 2022, 31,009. Chip has 2 sales. Chip has 2 sales. Joanna has 2 sales. And that brings me back to the program CS. And we can now tell our program to use that context builder, services, add DB context, sales context, options arrow, get connection string called sales context, triple parenthesis semicolon. Oh, too many. Okay. Again, we'll rerun this command a bunch, but add migration. Build succeeded, that's a good thing. Creating some tables, update database. Oops, update hyphen database. Done. Object Explorer, SQL Server, databases. What do we call this?
Quarterly sales.
Quarterly sales, tables, employees, view data, sales, view data. Okay, thinking about the next steps, thinking about just getting the data that's needed for that homepage. And so I mentioned a view model before, and we're gonna have in that view models kind of like joining all the sales and all the employees. So we'll have a list of sales, a list of employees, and we'll need an employee ID as well. So in our models folder, let's make a class sales list view model. Again, I think of a view model kind of like a join. You're just getting data from multiple tables in your C# class. So we're going to have a list of sales from the sales table. We'll have a list of employees. Employee ID, again, I think we use that employee ID up in the route, as you can kind of see here. There's an employee ID that we'll extract. So pretty simple view model, list of sales, list of employees, and employee ID. Now on the home controller, we can use this view model to send to the view, right? So the page is going to load. Don't need that, don't need that, don't need that, don't need that. So here's our index method on the home controller, and you can kind of see that might take in an ID. So there may be an ID there, there may not be an ID there. This could be done different ways, but I think it was last chapter where we learned about model binding and how to send in values into ID a couple different ways. So there might be an employee ID or there might not, right? So that's kind of the idea. We have to build a query that if there's an employee ID, then we filter it by that ID. Otherwise, we're just going to get all the sales or what, right? So the iQueryable interface, we're querying the sales table. Now we need a database context. So before I bring in a sales context, get set, and in our constructor, public home controller, sales context, give that a different identifier, CTX, context equals CTX. So we're building a query to hit the sales table, context.sales. Including the employee. Put this on different lines, that should work. Dot order by the year, sales s dot year. Some sort of ordering.
Do you want it order by descending?
It
Just order by.
makes me no difference. Whatever you prefer. Write a little if statement. If there's an ID greater than 0, then let's apply that filter. Query equals query where sales employee ID equals the ID that's passed in. So let's create a sales list view model. Use the object initializer syntax. We've got a sales, which is going to be our query to lists. Employees is basically a select star. Context, employees, order by first name. Pass the ID over, semicolon, return that view model to the view. We could decorate that with a get attribute, that is because we will have a post. Let's go ahead and decorate that index method as a get. We've got a lot open up, so I'm just going to close all but this. And hide my Object Explorer. Okay, so model controller view. So let's go into the views folder, home, index. Let's set our strongly typed model to sales list view model. The title to be quarterly sales. Bless you. bootstrap class of a row with some margin. So this basically takes this label and makes it a, you could probably figure out this out, but this label is going to take up 2 of our 10 spaces of our column, right? Then this column will take up 4 of the 12. This will take up 2 of the 12. This will take up 4 of the 12. And then you do div class. And then if you just do call, the way this will work is it'll do the math for you. It'll say, well, you've taken up six columns, so of course this can assume call medium 6, and it's the same with just doing call. And it just kind of calculates the remaining value there. So in our row, we got a label, call. Inside this medium for call, we'll have our drop-down list. Now this name is the secret sauce to send the employee ID into that parameter, right? So that parameter that we made on this home controller ID, this name attribute's going to be, okay, whatever employee is selected in this drop-down list is going to be sent over into there. Now, I want to make sure that I've got my tag helpers. I'm pretty sure I do. There's my tag helpers. So let's see if I get ASP hyphen. I'm not getting my tag helper colors.
Oh, you're within the inside. The
Oh, I'm in the wrong spot. Ha ha ha. Good eye. ASP items. So our model.employees is our data source. The selected value is in quotes. Oh, all the typos. Let's bring it back. Bring it back. I believe full name was capital N. Let me look at my employee full name. So we'll go through these different arguments into here. Okay, so the first argument is like, this is the data source for our items. The value is this one here. So your select option values, your values are the employee IDs. The display property would be the full name of the employees. That's why we made that full name property. And then this last one is the selected value. If there is an employee ID, that one will remain selected. Ryan, that's what we were talking about the other day. And you can pull that ID from your view model.
You know, when we were doing it, we did the name, not the ID. So that's probably why it doesn't work.
Bingo. So then we will have a default option value of 0. that says all. And a submit button. It says filter. Cool. And then next we need our table of sales. Table class of table. Table headings that say year, quarter, employee, and amount. Alright, now let's open up the body. For each sales, sale, and model sales. Year, quarter, employee full name. Employee full name. Is there a sale amount? If so, make it a currency. And in the table footer, span 3 columns, total sales, now this is kind of cool because it's a list of decimal. We can apply a sum where the money sum the amount, convert it to a currency. It's a little link query on a list, which when I first learned link, I learned how to do link on like arrays and on lists before I ever learned how to do link on databases. Now you put that little question mark to make sure you're not calling a toString if there are no sales. Thanks.
Lines 42 and 43, it doesn't like how you're calling a TD inside of a T-foot.
It's because you needed the TR.
I need the TR, good eye.
But wait, was that? Oh, I see. There's a total sales at the bottom.
All right, boot it up, see what's broke. Okay, I would expect it to not work at this point. But this is good that we don't have a post yet written, right? So we got to write this post to write the logic once we actually select an employee. Obviously Joyce does not have anything, but yeah, we don't have our post, so this is a working point. Looks like the total is coming in. All of our data is coming out of the database. We got our view model cooking, and we're in a good spot.
Can I see that sum part that you had on the
Yes, sir. We're going to go back to the home controller next and write that post.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Now, back in the home controller, underneath my index that's a get, we'll write an index that's a post. Now I do a redirect after I do my work in this method. So it's redirect action result. Takes in an employee object. Now going back to the view, you know, you're going to click post and it's really just the employee ID that should be coming into this post. So I think even though we're taking a full employee object, I'll put a breakpoint on this, and it should just be the employee ID that's filled out here. So you might just be able to accept an integer instead. Let's take a look at this logic. So here, string ID, does the employee ID greater than 0, right? If they post with the value of 0, if so, employee ID to string, otherwise and then we return redirect to action. Redirect to action. Okay, so we have an ID, right? So this employee is going to be bringing in an ID. That ID is like the number 1, 2, or 3. And we're checking to see, is that greater than 0? If it is, take the employee ID, which is an int, and convert it to a string, stored in a string, and then send that string up in the URL. I'm going to put a breakpoint there and just demonstrate kind of the look of this. And so if I search, I think Joanna would be employee ID 2. If I click filter, you can see that my employee object is full of nothing. It's just nothing. But it does have an employee ID of 2, right? Because that's coming across. The magic sauce there is this piece right here, name of employee ID, right? That's how you get from the form into that parameter. I'm going to refactor this just because I feel like it. But then this just makes sense. It takes the integer and converts it to a string, and then puts that in the ID route part of the ID segment of the route, right? So you can continue here, and now you can see index 2 And now that there is a 2 that's coming across in the URL, then it goes back to the get, right? That goes back to the get. ID would have 2 in it. And then we filter by employee ID 2. Just going to refactor this because I feel like, well, do we need an employee object when it's just really the ID that you're sending across? No. Oh, there you go. It already defines an index with an int ID, right? We have 2 method signatures that are the same. That's why I brought in the employee object to have different method signatures instead of index int, and then this one was also index int. So that explains that. In other words, you have overloaded methods here. The methods have the same name. They have to have a different signature. You can't have the same signature. Okay, so again, just to test it a little bit more before we move on and do some more validation. Chip, employee ID of 3, Joanna, employee ID of 2, Joyce, no sales. All, Chip, cool. Okay, I think the next thing to do is kind of set up the add employee view and the add employee controller. So that's where we're headed. So let me maybe close the home. We'll need to create a nav bar to go there. So let's go ahead and add a controller, the employee controller. And under views, let's add a folder called employee. And we're adding, right? So I'll add a new view called add. Add a view. There we go. Add .cshtml. Bring in our sales context. Constructor. If you do have these 2 things the same name, right? You can always say this dot context is always going to refer to the instance field, which is this variable on line 8, assigning the instance field equal to the parameter, which is inside of the parentheses here on line 10. So on our get, we're gonna send, there's a drop down list of employees, and so you have to send that over, and so we'll send that over in view bag. So again, this employees is a select star from the employees table, and we're going to pull out their information for a drop-down list. And so I'll code the view, and then I'll link to it in my nav bar, and then we'll load it, and then we'll continue to flesh out the view. So inside the add CSHTML of employee, okay, so we really just need to link to this in our layout. So under shared layout, we've got a nav bar. And here our second link will be instead the employee index. And this will say add employee. Oh, actually it was, I'm sorry, wasn't it?
It's called add.
Yeah. Call that the add method. Kind of the convention we've been using, so add. So it's slash employee slash add, and that brings us to add employee, back home. Correct. So back to the HTML. Now we don't have a method of posts. Okay, so we got on the span tag ASP validation 4 first name. That's our row for first name. We have another row for last name. So once you have that row for first name, it's a lot to type. So I'm going to copy and paste for last name and change what, just 3? Last name, last name, last name. Last name, last name, last name. Now, there's been a little bit of an internal debate in our class about the date controls. And so that's what's coming up next. So ASP4, date of birth. Date of birth, date of birth. But on the input, the book kind of recommends a type of text.
That's one part that I got stuck on, that it didn't like the way that I was inputting that date.
Yeah, I think this maybe gives you a little bit more control over that.
Yeah.
So that's the row for the date of birth. So we have another row for date of hire, so copy paste. Date of hire, date of hire, date of hire. Again, it's a date control, so type of text. Again, so you're just kind of going down through the properties. The next thing is to select a manager from a drop-down list. So this one's going to be a little bit different, so I'll code it from scratch. If class row Okay, so there's our label. So our data source is the view bag employees, the option values or the employee ID. The user sees the full name. And then option 0. Says all. No. Doesn't say anything, just leave it empty. I don't know how I feel about this kind of like let Bootstrap do the math on the columns. Again, it's like, okay, 2 for that, 4 for that, that should be a 6. But We'll let Bootstrap do the math. Then a little. Okay, there's the end of that row. And then the final row. Submit button. If you don't want to add an employee, you can cancel and take me home. We gotta write our little is model state valid inside of our post. So we just got the form set up. Back to our employee controller. Okay, pretty simple posts right now. It will get a little bit more complicated when we get to some custom validation. I'm going to pause and let you guys typing catch up because I know I went pretty fast. Okay, we did do a little bit with temp data, so I just
From the other drop down, is it?
I want to add in that temp data. I don't think so. So here, inside of main, so I'm back inside the layout, and I'll have an if temp data keys contains sorry, I didn't realize you stepped out. All we've done here, Vinny, is literally this 3-4 lines of code on side of layout.
Okay.
And in the controller, we saved a temp data
Yeah,
if an
I got
employee
that.
was added, and here we display that message. Okay, so this bullet is some custom validation. You know, date of birth and date of hire must be valid dates in the past, but the past is always changing. Like tomorrow will become the present and will become the past, right? So, so we can't like statically configure what the past is because the past is always changing. And so we got into in this chapter making custom attributes, and we'll do that here. We'll make a custom attribute to validate dates that are in the past. Again, working with dates and validation always a little bit more challenging. So in our models folder, this chapter and into the next, you will start actually having subfolders inside of models. And so I'll go ahead and I'll just start adding a new folder for validation purposes. So I'll add a validation folder, and I'll make a new class called a past date attribute. And so we kind of learn adding the word attribute is a convention, albeit shouldn't be mandatory, but it's a good convention. And you inherit from validation attribute. And you need to override. It would be nice if it would let me do control dot and enter, but it's not telling me what I need to override. Well, the method signature is this: protected override returns a validation result. Method is called isValid. There's suggesting it. There we go. Takes in a nullable object and a context. We'll call it CTX. If value is date time, okay, so we're casting this value that's passed in into a date time object. If date to check is less than date time today, so date time class has a static property called today. Validation passes. Otherwise, you kind of build this string and you basically give an error message. Your error message is your properties, so, you know, the display name of your property, which we configured on all of our properties, must be a valid past date. And we return new validation result with the error message. So it's really not a complex, I mean, you could break it down to this, like, hey, is it a date time? If that date is less than today, it passes validation. Otherwise, give them that error message and give them the error message. It's like it's actually not too bad of a syntax. I'm not mad at that. That's not too bad. Again, going back to the requirements, these are employees, date of birth and date of hire. So back in the employee model, let's go back into our employee model. Let's go to our dates. And we now have a past date that didn't exist before. And you can copy that attribute and paste it on the field there. Now, I mentioned earlier on that I'm probably going to drop my database. I don't know that I need to. I'm going to try this without dropping my database. I don't think that would change the database schema. Boom. Past date custom attribute working. Okay, kind of the next requirement here, the date of hire must not be before January 1st, 95, the date the company was founded. And so that's just a very similar attribute, so we'll code that one up. Greater than 1995, I guess you could call it. It's not really a range necessarily, so we'll make a custom attribute for add class greater than attribute. This one it winds up being a little bit more complex. So let's start it just the same. Overriding is valid. Now this one takes a constructor, greater than attribute, and initializes a field. So it just kind of gives us a value to compare, and we don't know what data type it could be. It could be different things. It could be different data types. And then we can check for those types in our method. So our method signature, just as before. Actually, I almost want to copy and paste this header. Copy that header. Paste it right here. And kind of just start this one off. 1995 is an int, so we'll be passing in a value. So let's cast that. And the value to compare it to will be that compare value. So keep in mind, the book covered when you're comparing values, it's not like we did before when we just had a past date, like there's just one input to that. They talked about, hey, you can actually pass in two inputs using the constructor. So you pass in one value on the constructor, you pass in another value from the form, and then you're comparing those two things. Again, the value coming from the form, and then the greater than attribute, this is going to come from our attribute on the employee model, right? So in the val will come in from this model. And so that's what we're doing here. So back on the employee model, on the hire date, we're going to send in a greater than, and this argument right here will get sent into the constructor, right? So that's why we coded that constructor that way, is that this is being one piece of data that you're comparing. The other piece of data is coming from the form that gets passed into value right here. So those are the two things that you're comparing. So the date is January 1st, 95. Right, so past date right here doesn't take any inputs. But this one does into the constructor.
Can you go back to the attribute?
Do I have that right? Greater than, so that's being, so int check. Oh yeah, that's coming in from the form. If the data from the form is greater than 1995, that's what this says. If the data from the form is greater than 1995, return success. Right? I would have maybe named these a little differently. Int to check would be the int from the form, and int to compare would be the 1995 from the attribute.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
So why is it an int and not a date in this case? And I know it's because the year is an int technically, but aren't you?
You know what? You're right. We're not. It's not an int. That would be a date. Because there was more to code out here that I didn't do.
Oh, okay.
Because this validation is used on other things. So else if, here's what we need. Value is date time. Glad you got that. Same process though. Casting it into a date time. Date to compare equals kind of a I mean, at the end of the day, we're doing the same thing as we are with the int. We're just using a different syntax for our date time. If date to check greater than date to compare, return success.
for line 26 is date time to check rather than just date to check. That was intentional.
Date to check is. Now, greater than 1995, that'll be a should be a date time. Let's see what breaks. Hire date January 1st, 1994. There we go.
Yep.
Okay, so on to the next requirement. It says a new employee may not have the same first, last, and date of birth as an employee that's already in the database. I think this is pretty cool, right? So we're going to hit the database and we're going to do some validation based on data that's stored in the database. And so in order to do this, on this textbook, we're on page 429, it talks about working with remote validation. Just to kind of summarize what this is, it says, in addition to enabling custom attributes that the validation runs on the client, you can write code on the server that's called by the client without reloading the page. This is called remote validation. You can use it when you need to perform a task on the server like accessing a database. To enable remote validation, you can use the remote attribute that's in the MVC namespace. Okay. And so we need to make a validation controller. It's kind of like the first step here. And then this validation controller is going to have some methods that are going to return JSON. And you might need some additional fields to kind of bring in. So in our controllers, let's add a validation controller.
It sounds really cool when you talk about it, but then you try to.
We're gonna get it. So far, so good. So far, so good. And the method here is called check employee, and the method is returning a JSON result. And there's really three things that we're checking: a date of birth, which is the date time, first name, and a last name. Good old var and C#. Now we need to include our models. So let's include a using employee validation dot models, so that my employee object is recognized. First name, last name, DOB, date of birth. Now we're working with the database, so we need to bring in the context. So let's bring in the context. Private sales context. We'll just call it context. I don't think I need this index method. Let's bring in a constructor. Let's go ahead and hit our database. Okay, so we got a database employee, first or default, the employee where the employee first name is the first name, last name is the last name, date of birth is the date of birth.
But you need employee dot date of birth. You just have DOB.
Yeah. Quite honestly, you probably just get away with the, don't even make the employee object and just check it against the parameters.
So that's where I went wrong, I think, a little bit. And for some reason, if it's not like an employee object, it throws a bunch of weird errors. I could be wrong about that, but that's what happened to me.
Okay.
So
Yeah, I guess if you're hitting a database
it like didn't,
table
like,
of employee.
it didn't like certain like nullable values, you know. So like yeah, it was just weird.
Yeah. One second here. So here we would check against null. FDB emp is null. And return something else. Return something else. So if there is no database employee, we're going to return true, and that's going to enable us to do an insert. Otherwise, return I'm going to return some JSON here. So, which is just going to be a string. Employee full name
got stuck on was the first or default. I was doing like dot include for like everything, and it didn't like that. Obviously.
Got it.
So that's
Not include typically, and when you're joining the tables.
yeah. I just didn't know those down.
Okay, so this makes sense, right? If there is no database, we're just returning a value that says true. Otherwise, we're returning a JSON with some string in it.
What does that return true? What does that mean?
Well, we're gonna have to use that true value and allow the insert kind of thing. Okay, so what we're going to try here is to put this remote tag on the date of birth on the employee, because that's kind of in order. You got a first name at that point, you got a last name at that point, and you got a date of birth. So we're going to say remote, and the method that we wrote is the check employee method that is inside of the validation controller. And we also want to pass in from this model the first name and the last name.
You want to pass it in as like one big string or two separate?
Those are the fields.
Those are the fields from this model
Yeah, okay.
that also that this method uses, right? So this is using the date of birth, then the first name and the last name.
Well, I asked that because you put a comma. You didn't do two separate strings. You did like name and last name under one string.
It's supposed to be one big string.
Wait a minute, I thought I did two. No, I did two.
It's just that's just how it is written out. Okay, so that's how it gets the first name, last name, and date of birth is because it already gets date of birth because it's put on that
Bingo.
as the attribute, and then you write in the additional fields to bring in the other ones.
Bingo.
But then, as check employee is like a method like that, and it's written out like that,
Yep.
it doesn't really matter how. Like I could put last name before first name on that additional fields, and it's not really gonna matter as long as all of those match up. I think
I think you're right.
That's what I'm like not understanding how, you know, it's capital F first name, capital L last name gets to, you know, there where it's lowercase and lowercase. It's like, how does it know?
Right, because they're just strings, so the order has to matter.
I don't know. I'm asking you. I have no idea.
No, I'm agree. Your assumptions are correct, is what I'm saying.
Yeah,
Is
okay.
that first name is just a string, last name is just a string. So you're basically passing in other words, I would not put last name and then first name because they're just strings.
Okay. And date of birth is first because that's what you're originally
Yeah.
getting. So it does. So the order does matter.
Yeah.
then. Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Now the question is what breaks. So we know who's in our employee. And the question is, do we know their birth dates? So I'm going to pull on Chip here because Chip gains It's been a long day. Is it Chip enjoying the games? Or is it something? Is his name not Chip? Did I get that wrong?
I thought it was Chip.
Is it Chip? I'm second guessing like
Chip's not even a real name.
To me, you guys are just talking about like literal imaginary people.
They're HGTV stars.
Never.
Remember the Magnolia Network?
Yeah, it is Chip enjoying the games. Come on. These guys. It's like America's sweethearts.
It literally could be any random couple.
Okay, what's Chip's birthday is the question.
You should know this. You're a big Chip fan.
I'm the big Chip. We said that Chip was born in January 10th, 1980. So let's boot it up. Let's just close all tabs. Well, you would have liked to see a error message. Let's just okay, troubleshooting time. So what I needed to remember to do was to add the method call in the post. So let's go to the employee controller, and we got to flush this out a little bit more here. So here's the server side checks for remote validation, and that's what I left off. And here's the message. Now I tried something fancy. I tried to get fancy and refactor some things, and I put it all inside of here. But I'm gonna undo that refactoring, so I gotta take a step back into my validation controller. This line is good. I tried to okay. Inside of validation, there's a static class with static methods that I'm going to create. So inside validation, add a class called validate. And public static class is going to be full of static methods, public static. And so I tried not doing this, but you call this method in two places, not just one. So I'm going to bring this back, and this code is basically the same thing that we just wrote. Var employee. Actually, I could probably copy and paste. Probably copy and paste from validation controller this line right here. Bring it back in and clean it up. So I just took that method and
load them.
Just gonna use rejects.
If there's information wrong with the first time, you just lock them out of the system.
There you go.
Yeah, punish them. It's like, oh, you will be stupid. Surprise to pay. We'll pay for your sins. I agree.
Validate dot check employee. That's the method we just wrote. Pass in our context and our employee object. And if string is null or empty, so my bad on that. That allows us, now that we wrote this class called validate that has a check employee method, let me go back to the employee model. We've got remote check employee validation.
Can you just do a validation component?
Yep. Now that we've taken 2 steps backwards, let's see if we can take 1 step forward. And on the add method, we're going to call validate dot check employee context employee, and if string is null or empty, the string is not null or empty, model state add model error putting the error on the date of birth property, and the message is coming from way back here, already in the database. So obviously this will trigger model state to be invalid. And so that's why it wasn't working last time. Let's see why it's not working this time. And I'm going to put a breakpoint in right there and try my chip gains again. Oh. What was his birthday? I also don't remember.
Chip gains 12, 10, 1956. That's what I put.
I got January 10th of 80.
Oh, no. Yes.
It works? All right.
For me, it does.
Don't be so surprised, teacher.
It's just, man, that's a lot of stuff to do for one little thing. But it is nice to have.
Looks like it's going to work for me.
Yeah.
No, that's pretty cool.
That's really
That's pretty cool. It was a lot of work, but you think about what it's doing. That's pretty cool.
It's, yeah, it's worth it.
It's worth it, yeah.
Mine's not.
That's all right.
You gotta rate it.
Okay, so we got those checked, and we're on to this one. A new employee may not have a manager with the same first, last, and date of birth. That is, an employee may not be the same person as the manager. Okay, so close that, close that. Let's write inside of our validate class. So it winds up being that we call these methods in two places. Inside of our validation controller, the validation controller is called from the attributes on the model. Right? So we call this from within the validation controller, and we call it from within the employee controller when we want to add an employee. So we call these methods that we're writing in here in those two places. This will be public static string check
Check your spelling on that employee at the top. Line 20. Oh no, at the very end.
just call them emp.
That's easy.
This is gonna have to be different for people who did the employee or managers as their own table, right?
So
You should still be able to run it by manager ID. Like in the employees table.
Yeah, but you can't find their
Oh, I see what you're saying.
like you have to get it from the manager's table.
yeah, probably be
Think
different. If
about
your
it.
database schema is different, it ultimately is there's going to be differences.
Yeah, I don't think it'll be too different.
You might be able to work through it. Now remember, a find, going all the way back to chapter 4, when we had our different link methods. Find returns the instance of the entity by the ID for its primary key. So we're passing in a manager ID, but we're doing a find on the employees table, which is primary key is the employee ID. So we are ultimately finding an employee, calling them a manager. So back in our validation controller now. Oh, broke one. Okay, a couple more things and then I'm just gonna test it. We're getting towards the end of the day, so I'm gonna keep moving. On the employee model, this is on the manager ID column. So the check manager method of the validation controller additional fields. First name. Last name.
I think it's all one string, right? Or something?
Yeah. Your additional fields.
Oh, derp. Because we wrote this greater than, remember we checked for ints, we can also do greater than 0 here. Not greater than, greater than. Kind of doing two things here at once. Error. Okay. Okay, again, kind of going here, first name, last name, DOB. So it's going to go manager ID first and first, last, DOB. So I should be able to go to my validation controller, ID first, last, DOB. That's what Josh was pointing out about the order. That's right, Vinny.
He just talks and yawns, man.
So the last thing is on our employee controller, right, to add a little validate check here as well. So can reassign message, validate check. Basically, if there is a message, and model state, add model error. I think this goes to Oladeji's point, is who in their right mind would be doing this? Accidents happen. Accidents happen.
And so
And
when you try to input an employee that would have the same manager, wouldn't it just the check employee like hit anyway because you're already trying to input an employee that's in the database?
that already exists.
Yeah.
I was getting that for sure.
I don't understand like what that's doing differently.
Well, let's.
Stop being knucklehead trying to carry on that.
Cause you'd have to be inputting an employee that already.
Yeah, I was getting
An employee that already exists.
Right.
So it is hitting both. It is hitting it. But to your point, yeah, it is hitting both.
should do, right?
Yeah. Now, There could be different chip gains, but it does check, the manager does check for date of birth being the same as well.
Yeah.
Date of birth. So it's in both.
You're just like, that's good.
That's fine.
Good enough.
Yeah. I mean, we are checking that.
Well, cause I don't know if this is like the same thing what they're saying, but if you just change the date of birth, then you'll be able to, it won't error out, right?
Right. Yeah, if I change the date of birth here to 1981 instead of 1980. Except for he's not in the database.
Yeah, I get two errors, that they're already in the database and that they can't be the same person. I think that's kind of what we were expecting, no?
Right. Let's take a quick one more look.
Like, there's no way the second error hits without the first error hitting, is all I'm saying.
You know what? Why don't you teach the class?
I'm just saying, it's not.
Well, he's not wrong,
I'm just messing.
but let's go back to the lab and let's just make sure, because here, that's what they're showing here, right? It's literally in the. It's kind of like writing the same validation twice. That's fine. I think, right, now that we've done this, I think we can hit the sales. We'll just hit the sales tomorrow. We'll just finish this up. We've checked all these requirements. We'll check all these requirements and finish her up.